In the unforgiving embrace of Montana in the year 1883, where bone-deep winds sweep away unfinished dreams and the hardened soil tests even the strongest hearts, a quiet story began to bloom in the ruins. Not a legend passed around campfires, but something real. The story of a man who had lost everything, and a woman who carried within her the last flicker of hope. This wasn't love at first sight. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a love carved slowly with patience, forged through pain, and blossomed through forgiveness.
In the unforgiving embrace of the Montana Territory, where hope often withers like spring flowers in August heat, a tale of quiet devotion unfolds beneath the vast western sky. The year is 1885, and the bustling town of Copper Creek harbors a truth as old as the mountains themselves, that worth isn't measured in polish and shine, but in the steadfast nature of a heart that refuses to break its word. When Sarah Bennett steps down from the stagecoach, her eastern refinement still crisp as fresh linen, she sees right through the dust-covered stable hand who lingers in the shadows of her new life. Yet as summer turns to winter, and false promises scatter like tumbleweeds across the prairie, it's his unwavering presence that will teach her the true meaning of loyalty. Could the man she once deemed invisible become her most steadfast guardian? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Bennett's fingers traced the worn silver locket at her throat as the stagecoach lurched to a halt, sending a cloud of Montana dust billowing past the windows. Inside the locket, her mother's face smiled from a faded photograph, the last remnant of a life left behind in Boston's refined parlors. She tucked it beneath her high-necked blouse, straightened her spine, and waited for the driver to open the door. "Welcome to Copper Creek, Ma'am," he announced, offering a weathered hand to assist her descent. Sarah accepted it with the practiced grace her finishing school had instilled, though her legs trembled from the 3-day journey. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town's main street, where wooden boardwalks stretched past, an assortment of businesses bearing fresh paint and proud signage. A woman of less determination might have faltered at the sight of her new home. Copper Creek was a far cry from Boston's cobblestone streets and gaslit avenues. Here, the wind carried the scent of sage and horse, and the buildings, though sturdy, showed the raw edges of a town still carving its place from the wilderness. "Your trunks, Miss Bennett?" The driver's question drew her attention to the practical matters at hand. She turned, prepared to direct him, only to find another figure, already moving toward the coach's storage compartment. He worked quietly, this stable hand, his movements efficient and sure, despite the trail dust that seemed to have settled into every crease of his clothing. When he lifted her largest trunk as if it weighed nothing, Sarah noticed his hands, strong, capable things that spoke of honest work. "The Continental Hotel, if you please," she said, more to the air than to him directly. He didn't respond, simply nodded and began the task of transferring her belongings. Sarah found herself oddly unsettled by his silence, though she couldn't say why. In Boston, servants knew their place and kept to it, but this man's silence felt different, not subservient, but simply unnecessary of words. "Miss Bennett?" A new voice drew her attention. "I'm Mrs. Harrison, owner of the Continental." The woman approaching was perhaps 50, her grey-streaked hair arranged neatly beneath a practical bonnet. She carried herself with the confident air of someone long accustomed to managing both property and people. "We've prepared your room, as requested. You'll find it quite comfortable, I think, especially for extended stays." Sarah smiled, grateful for this touch of feminine civility. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. I look forward to making your establishment my home while I settle my affairs in town." She followed the older woman toward the hotel's entrance, aware of the stable hand following at a discreet distance with her trunks. The hotel's interior offered a welcome respite from the dust and heat. Dark wooden floors gleamed with care, and the wallpaper, though not of the latest fashion, was clean and well-maintained. The sitting room to their right held several occupied chairs, their inhabitants casting curious glances at the new arrival. "You'll find Copper Creek quite civilized, despite appearances," Mrs. Harrison remarked as they climbed the stairs. "We have a doctor, a proper church, and several quite refined families among our residents. Though I understand you plan to establish your own business?" "Yes, a millinery shop," Sarah confirmed. "I've arranged to view a property tomorrow morning." She thought of the carefully planned figures in her journal, each column of numbers representing another step toward independence. They reached her room, a corner chamber with windows facing both the street and the distant mountains. The stable hand appeared moments later with her trunks, setting them down without flourish or expectation. Sarah reached for her reticule to offer a tip, but he was already gone, leaving only the faintest trace of leather and horse in his wake. "That's Thomas," Mrs. Harrison offered, noting Sarah's puzzled expression. "Manages the livery stable down the street. Man of few words, but reliable as sunrise. If you need a mount while you're here, or any repairs done, he's the one to see." Sarah nodded absently, already turning her attention to the practical matters of unpacking. The stable hand, Thomas, was merely another piece of the landscape, no more remarkable than the dust on her shoes or the distant cry of a meadowlark. Her fingers found the silver locket again, seeking its familiar comfort. Tomorrow would bring the first real steps toward her new life, and she had no time to waste on unnecessary observations. Yet later that evening, as she sat at the small writing desk recording her first impressions of Copper Creek in her journal, she found herself noting the curious quality of silence that had surrounded him. Not the tense silence of servitude, but the natural quiet of a man at peace with his place in the world. She crossed out the observation with a firm stroke of her pen. Such fanciful thoughts had no place in her carefully ordered plans. The deed to the millinery shop lay before her on the banker's desk, its official letterhead gleaming with fresh ink. Sarah studied the document carefully, her eyes lingering on each carefully penned word. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was her declaration of independence, purchased with 3 years of carefully hoarded savings and countless hours of practice at her craft. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Fleming," she said, reaching for the pen. The banker's smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he watched her sign, and Sarah wondered if he, like so many others, doubted a woman's ability to manage her own affairs. Let him doubt. She had not come west to seek anyone's approval. The bell above the shop door chimed its first welcome that very afternoon. Sarah stood in her newly acquired space, surrounded by boxes yet to be unpacked, when Mrs. Harrison appeared with several of the town's prominent ladies in tow. "We simply couldn't wait to welcome you properly," announced Mrs. Whitaker, wife of the mining company's superintendent. She was a woman who wore her wealth like armor, each piece of jewelry carefully selected to remind others of her position. "Copper Creek has been desperately in need of a proper milliner." Sarah accepted their greetings with practiced grace, even as she noted the calculating looks they cast around her humble shop. The space needed work. The shelves were worn, the counter's finish had seen better days, and the back room's window stuck halfway up, letting in the persistent Montana wind. "Of course, you'll want to make some improvements," Mrs. Whitaker continued, running a gloved finger along the dusty counter. "My Henry knows several excellent craftsmen who could—" A quiet creak interrupted her words. The back door had opened, admitting Thomas from the livery stable. Without ceremony or introduction, he crossed to the stuck window, tools already in hand. The ladies drew back slightly, as if his dust might somehow taint their fine dresses. "I didn't send for—" Sarah began, but Mrs. Harrison touched her arm gently. "He probably heard me mention the window needed fixing this morning," the older woman murmured. "He's observant that way." They watched as Thomas worked, his movements economical and sure. Within minutes, the window slid smoothly in its frame, and he was testing the latch with careful attention to its mechanism. When he finished, he simply nodded once and left as quietly as he'd come. "Well," Mrs. Whittaker sniffed, "I suppose that's one repair dealt with. Though really, my dear, you should consider having the entire place renovated. First impressions are so important in business." Sarah found herself staring at the now functional window, something uncertain stirring in her thoughts. "Thank you for the suggestion, Mrs. Whittaker. I'll certainly give it consideration." But even as she spoke the polite words, she was making calculations in her journal that evening, measuring her resources against her needs. The next few days fell into a pattern. Each morning brought new tasks, unpacking inventory, arranging displays, preparing her workroom. And each day she would discover some small repair completed in the quiet hours of dawn or dusk, a loose floorboard secured, a stubborn door rehung, a leak in the roof mysteriously mended. Thomas never announced his presence or sought recognition. The only signs of his passing were the improvements themselves, and occasionally the faint scent of leather and horses that lingered in the air. Sarah found herself noting these changes in her journal each evening, alongside her careful business records. She told herself it was simply good accounting, tracking repairs that might need future maintenance. Yet she couldn't quite explain why. She also recorded the way the morning light caught the fresh paint he'd touched up around her window frames, or how the repaired bell now rang with a tone that somehow matched the quiet dignity of his work. "Your shop is coming along nicely," Mrs. Harrison commented one week after the opening, though perhaps not quite in the grand style Mrs. Whittaker suggested. Sarah looked around at her modest but welcoming space, where every repair bore the mark of careful attention rather than showy display. "No," she agreed softly, "perhaps not, but some things are better built on foundations of substance rather than show." She didn't realize then how prophetic those words would prove to be. Sarah's collection of calling cards grew steadily over the next few weeks, each embossed rectangle a promise of social connection. She arranged them carefully in the silver card holder she'd brought from Boston, admiring how they spoke of civilization. Taking root in this frontier town, Mrs. Whittaker's card sat at the front, its elaborate script and gold edges declaring its owner's prominence, followed by a dozen others representing Copper Creek's finest families. "You simply must join us for tea on Thursday," Mrs. Whittaker had insisted, pressing her card into Sarah's hand. "All the ladies who matter will be there." The invitation felt like validation, proof that a woman could maintain refinement even in the West. That Thursday found Sarah in Mrs. Whittaker's parlor, surrounded by the gentle clink of fine china and the rustle of silk skirts. The conversation flowed like the tea, smooth and carefully steeped in propriety. "Miss Bennet," Mrs. Whittaker began, setting down her cup with practiced grace, "we've been so curious about your background. One doesn't often find such accomplished women venturing west alone." The pause before accomplished carried weight, and Sarah felt the other lady's attention sharpen. "My family has always valued independence," Sarah replied carefully, remembering her mother's teachings about revealing just enough to satisfy without exposing one's vulnerabilities. "And my father's investments left me well positioned to establish my own enterprise." A subtle ripple passed through the gathering. Mrs. Whittaker's eyebrows rose slightly. "Investments, you say? How fascinating. And these investments, they're quite substantial." Something in her tone should have warned Sarah, but the warmth of inclusion proved too seductive. Over the next hour, she found herself sharing more than she'd intended, speaking of her father's railroad shares, her own careful management of her inheritance, her plans for expanding the millinery business. The next morning, Sarah's shop door chimed frequently, but not with customers. Instead, a parade of investment opportunities appeared. Mrs. Whittaker's cousin had a promising silver mine. Mrs. Henderson's brother was organizing a cattle drive. Mrs. Patterson knew of a land speculation venture that simply couldn't fail. Each visitor came armed with documents and enthusiasm, their eyes bright with what Sarah now recognized as hunger rather than friendship. Their calling cards accumulated on her counter like fallen leaves, no longer symbols of connection, but warnings of predatory intent. She might have succumbed to one of their schemes, might have mistaken their urgency for genuine concern for her welfare, if not for a chance observation through her shop window. Thomas was shoeing a horse outside his stable, his movements patient and methodical. A well-dressed man, one of Mrs. Whitaker's mining investors, approached him, gesturing animatedly about something. Thomas simply continued his work, unmoved by whatever grand promises were being made. Eventually, the man left, his frustration evident in every step. That evening, as Sarah reviewed her accounts, a shadow darkened her doorway. Thomas entered silently, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. He placed it on her counter without ceremony and turned to leave. "Wait," Sarah called, surprising herself. "What is this?" He paused, one hand on the door. "Found it in my father's things. Thought you might want to see it." His voice was quiet, rusty with disuse, but clear. The package contained a newspaper from 5 years ago, its pages yellowed but legible. There, in stark print, was the story of a mining scandal that had ruined dozens of Eastern investors. The mastermind behind the scheme bore the same surname as Mrs. Whitaker's cousin. Sarah's fingers trembled as she read. When she looked up to thank him, Thomas was already gone. That night, she removed the calling cards from their silver holder one by one. In their place, she put the newspaper clipping, a reminder that true friendship rarely announced itself with gilt edges and flowing script. The next day, when Mrs. Whitaker arrived with yet another investment opportunity, Sarah was prepared. "I'm afraid I must decline," she said firmly. "My capital is fully committed to my business here." The other woman's smile thinned. "My dear, you really must learn to think bigger. We were also hoping you would fit in here." "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "But I believe I'll find my own way to belong." Through the window, she caught a glimpse of Thomas steadily working at his forge. The rhythm of his hammer against iron sang a song of constancy that no elaborate calling card could match. Charles Wellington swept into Copper Creek like a Chinook wind, bringing with him the polish of San Francisco and the promise of progress. His gold-plated watch caught the sunlight as he descended from the newer, more elegant stagecoach line he'd helped establish. Within days, his name graced everyone's lips, the businessman who would bring the railroad's prosperity to their humble town. Sarah first met him when he came to order a hat for his sister back east. "Something elegant," he'd said, his smile warming his handsome features. "Price is no object for family." He lingered after placing the order, admiring her workmanship with what seemed like genuine appreciation. "I must say, Miss Bennet, finding such refined talent in Copper Creek is an unexpected pleasure." His voice carried the cultured tones of education and travel. "Perhaps you'd do me the honor of dining at the hotel this evening? I'd love to discuss the possibility of expanding your enterprise once the railroad arrives." The gold watch gleamed as he checked the time, a gesture he would repeat often in her presence, as if to remind her of his prosperity. Sarah found herself watching its shine, remembering how her father had owned a similar timepiece. Charles noticed her attention and smiled. "A gift from the railroad board," he explained, holding it out for her inspection. "They know the value of punctuality and precision." The watch was beautiful, its case engraved with his initials and the railroad's emblem. Everything about Charles Wellington spoke of success and ambition. That evening at dinner, he regaled her with tales of business triumphs and cultural attractions in San Francisco. "You remind me of that city," he said, his eyes warm with admiration. "Too much refinement for a small town like this. With the railroad coming, you could establish shops all along the line." Sarah felt herself drawn in by his vision. Here was a man who understood progress, who saw beyond the dusty limitations of frontier life. When he presented her with a small, velvet-covered box a week later, she hardly hesitated to open it. Inside lay a delicate watch on a golden chain, a feminine echo of his own. "So we can count the moments until the railroad brings us our fortune," he said, fastening it around her neck. She didn't notice Thomas watching from the stable doorway as Charles helped her into her carriage that evening. Didn't see the stable hand's slight frown as he studied the businessman's elegant profile. Sarah was too caught up in dreams of expansion and opportunity to heed the quiet warning in Thomas's steady gaze. But she did notice over the next few weeks how Charles's stories began to shift and change. The railroad's arrival date moved from autumn to winter, then to spring. Each delay came with a logical explanation and a fresh promise of greater returns. "The thing about opportunity," Charles explained over another elegant dinner, "is that it requires investment. A small risk now for tremendous returns later." His fingers brushed the watch at her throat. "I could help you position your business ahead of the curve, for a modest partnership stake, of course." That night, as Sarah recorded the evening's conversation in her journal, a memory surfaced. Thomas's silent delivery of that telling newspaper. She found herself wondering why a simple stable hand would keep old papers about financial scandals. The answer came the next morning, not from Thomas, but from the telegraph operator who burst into her shop, waving an urgent message. Charles. Wellington had been arrested in Denver. The railroad contract was fictional. The gold watch he wore, plated brass, just like the dreams he'd sold to countless other towns. Sarah's fingers flew to the watch at her throat, its ticking now a reminder of her own willingness to be deceived. Through her shop window, she could see Thomas at his forge, his rhythm unchanged by the scandal unfolding across the street. He'd known, she realized, not from any special information, but from years of watching men who wore false gold and spoke false promises. That evening, she placed both watches in a box, hers and the one Charles had accidentally left behind. There, matching shine now seemed less like prosperity and more like a carefully crafted illusion. Real gold, she was beginning to understand, didn't need to announce itself quite so loudly. The broken wagon wheel might have been the last straw. Sarah stood in the muddy street, staring at the splintered wood that had finally surrendered to Montana's ruthless spring thaws. Her latest shipment of materials, expensive ribbons and delicate laces ordered months ago, lay precariously balanced in the wagon's tilted bed. Rain threatened overhead, and the freight driver had already disappeared, mumbling apologies and promises to return tomorrow. Sarah felt the familiar weight of isolation settling on her shoulders. In Boston, there had always been someone to call upon, services to hire, problems to be solved with money and connections. The sound of boots approaching through the mud made her stiffen her spine, preparing to maintain dignity in the face of town gossip. But it was only Thomas, surveying the damage with his usual quiet focus. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice as rough and honest as the weathered boards of his stable. Without further discussion, he began carefully transferring her boxes to a wheelbarrow she hadn't noticed him bringing. Sarah found herself working alongside him, their movements falling into a natural rhythm. He didn't offer empty consolation or unwanted advice, just steady help and the occasional murmured direction about which boxes might be more vulnerable to the weather. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, they secured the last of her goods in her shop's back room. Thomas disappeared briefly, returning with tools that spoke of long use and careful maintenance. He set to work on the wheel without ceremony, his hands moving with the sure knowledge of someone who had mended many broken things. "You don't have to," Sarah began, but stopped herself. Something in the quiet purpose of his work made her usual protests feel unnecessary. The rain drummed on the roof as she worked inside, unpacking her shipment and recording inventory in her ledger. Occasionally, she would glance out to see Thomas still there, steadily working despite the weather. He had positioned himself so that his broad shoulders kept the worst of the rain off the wheel as he worked. Near sunset, the rain eased, and Sarah heard the distinct sound of the wagon being moved. She stepped outside to find it properly aligned, the wheel not just repaired but improved with what looked like new spokes. "Should hold better now," Thomas said, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. "Pine wasn't right for this climate. Used oak." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of the original wheel. "See here, wood was green when they made it, bound to fail come spring." It was the most she'd ever heard him say at once. Sarah found herself studying the piece of pine he offered, noting the tight grain and subtle signs of poor seasoning. "You know a great deal about wood." He shrugged, but she caught the slight warmth in his eyes at her observation. "Learned from my pa. He built furniture back east before." He trailed off, and Sarah understood there was a story there, one that might explain why a man with such knowledge worked in a frontier stable. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing somehow that he would prefer directness to elaborate gratitude. "What do I owe you for the oak?" Had it lying around. He gathered his tools with the same care he'd shown in his work. "Wheels should last now, but if it gives you trouble," he left the offer unspoken but clear. That evening, as Sarah updated her accounts, she found herself holding the piece of pine he'd shown her. A thought occurred that made her pause, pen hovering over paper. Charles Wellington had offered her golden promises and elaborate dreams. Thomas had offered her oak and honest work. She wrapped the piece of pine in a handkerchief and placed it in her desk drawer. Later, she would understand it as the moment she began to truly see the man behind the dust and silence. But for now, she simply appreciated having someone in copper. Creek she could trust to do what he said and say what he meant. The next morning, she noticed the wagon's other wheel had been quietly replaced as well, sturdy oak gleaming dully in the dawn light. The sheriff's notice appeared on a Tuesday morning, its official letterhead stark against the weather-beaten board outside his office. Sarah might have missed it entirely if not for the unusual quiet that had fallen over the normally bustling street. She paused on her way to open the shop, the morning's fresh bread from the bakery still warm in her basket. Randall's gang spotted. "Near Silver Creek," Mrs. Harrison murmured, appearing at Sarah's elbow. "Less than 2 days' ride from here." The older woman's voice carried the weight of experience. "Last time they came through these parts, 3 towns lost their bank holdings. 2 people died." Sarah studied the notice more carefully now. The official language couldn't disguise the gravity of the warning. A gang of 12 men, well armed and ruthless, moving north along the territory's main trade route. Copper Creek lay directly in their path. "They're organizing a town meeting," Mrs. Harrison continued. "Tonight at the church." She hesitated, then added, "You might want to consider moving your cash box to the bank vault, dear. Sheriff Thompson says it's the most secure building in town." But Sarah remembered Charles Wellington's smooth assurances about security and investment. "I think I'll keep my arrangements as they are," she said quietly. Through the morning haze, she could see Thomas at his stable, methodically checking the doors and windows. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her the slightest of nods. The town meeting that evening was a study in barely contained fear. Sheriff Thompson stood before the packed pews, his badge catching the lamplight as he detailed his preparations. The bank vault would indeed be fortified, he explained. Additional deputies would be sworn in. The town's women and children were advised to stay inside after sunset. "What about those of us who live alone?" The question came from Miss Hayes, the telegraph operator. Other women murmured in agreement, their faces showing similar concern. "Perhaps some of the ladies could stay together," suggested Mrs. Whitaker from her prominent position in the front pew. "Those of us with larger homes would be happy to—" "No need for that yet," the sheriff interrupted. "We've got men watching. The approaches to town. If Randall's bunch shows up, we'll have warning." Sarah noticed Thomas standing at the back of the church, his expression thoughtful as he listened. When the meeting ended, she watched him speak briefly with the sheriff, their conversation too low to hear, but clearly serious. The next morning, Sarah found additional locks had been installed on her shop's doors and windows. The work was neat, professional, and unmistakably Thomas's. What surprised her was discovering similar improvements on other buildings up and down the street. Miss Hayes's telegraph office, the seamstress's shop, the widow Carson's boarding house, all women living or working alone. When she saw Thomas, later that day, he was showing Mrs. Harrison's kitchen girl how to brace a door with a simple wooden bar. He didn't explain or seek praise. He simply moved through the town like a quiet guardian, anticipating needs and addressing vulnerabilities. He was a carpenter once, Mrs. Harrison shared over tea that afternoon, before the war changed everything. My Harold knew him back east, said Thomas built the finest cabinets he'd ever seen. Then Gettysburg happened and, well, she sighed, some men come back different. Thomas came back quiet, but he never lost that way of seeing how things fit. Together, how to make them strong. Sarah thought about the oak wagon wheels, the perfectly hung doors, the silent improvements that made life in Copper Creek more secure. She thought about Charles Wellington's gold watch and empty promises, about Mrs. Whitaker's grand home built on other people's losses. That evening, as she prepared to close her shop, she heard horses approaching, not the usual evening traffic, but the purposeful sound of a large group moving fast. Her heart jumped until she recognized Sheriff Thompson's voice calling out the all clear. Just a cattle drive passing through, seeking shelter from the coming storm. But in that moment of uncertainty, she'd found herself looking not toward the bank's reinforced vault, but toward the stable where a quiet man had already begun leading horses inside, making room for the unexpected visitors. Their eyes met through the gathering dusk, and Sarah realized something that had been slowly building since the day he'd first fixed her shop window. In a town full of people speaking of security, Thomas simply provided it. The sheriff's notice remained posted, its warning still potent. But Sarah slept more soundly that night, knowing that not all protection came with badges and announcements. Sometimes it came with calloused hands and careful attention to the strength of doors and the quality of wood. The empty strongbox mocked Sarah from its hiding place beneath the floorboards. Where there had been nearly $800 in cash and banknotes yesterday, now only her mother's silver locket remained, somehow overlooked in the thief's haste. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, remembering James Crawford's smooth assurances just 3 weeks ago. As your banker, Miss Bennet, I must advise against keeping such sums in a simple shop safe, he had said, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the afternoon light. These are dangerous times. Why, just yesterday I was discussing security with Sheriff Thompson. She should have recognized the calculation beneath his professional concern. But James Crawford had seemed the very model of frontier respectability, Harvard-educated, impeccably dressed, and recommended by the town's most prominent citizens. When he spoke of special arrangements for valued customers, of private accounts, offering higher returns than the public rates, she had wanted to believe. It's really quite simple, he had explained, laying out documents in precise rows on her counter. A private investment account, separate from the bank's general holdings. For select customers only, you understand. With Randall's gang in the own territory, wouldn't you rest easier knowing your capital was properly secured? Sarah's fingers curled around the silver locket as the memory burned. She had been careful this time, or thought she had. No flashy promises like Charles Wellington's railroad schemes, just sound banking practices backed by brick walls and steel vaults. Yet here she stood, her savings gone, with nothing but a hastily scrawled note announcing Crawford's departure for urgent business in Denver. The shop bell's chime startled her. She quickly wiped her eyes, ready to paste on a smile for customers, but it was Thomas who stood in the doorway. Without a word, he placed a newspaper on her counter, not yesterday's edition, but one from 3 months ago. The story, circled in careful pencil, detailed the conviction of a banking confidence man in Wyoming territory. The accompanying photograph showed a younger, clean-shaven James Crawford being led away in handcuffs. "When did you know?" Sarah asked, her voice barely steady. "Something about his hands," Thomas replied after a moment. "Too soft for honest money." He paused, then added quietly, "Tried to sell me shares last week. Same scheme he used in Cheyenne. Why didn't you warn me?" The question held more hurt than accusation. Thomas met her eyes steadily. "Did. That day he first came in. Brought you that invoice for the stable repairs." She remembered he had lingered longer than usual, seemed about to speak several times. "Wasn't my place to say more," he finished simply. Sarah sank into her chair, understanding now. The invoice had been for minor work, yet Thomas had hand-delivered it just as Crawford was making his first pitch. Had tried, in his way, to create a moment of contrast between honest work and smooth promises. She had been too dazzled by Crawford's financial acumen to see the message in Thomas's timing. "The sheriff's been telegraphed," Thomas offered. "They'll catch him, man like that, running's all he knows." Sarah looked around her shop, at the sturdy shelves Thomas had built, the strong oak counter that had replaced the original rickety one, the secure windows and doors that had nothing to do with Crawford's promises of protection. "I was so focused on securing my future," she whispered. "I couldn't see what was already solid beneath my feet." Thomas moved to leave, then hesitated. From his pocket, he drew a small leather pouch that clinked softly. "I've been saving," he said, placing it carefully beside her mother's locket, "for new tack, but the old'll do another season." Sarah stared at the pouch, her throat tight. "I can't." "Loan," he interrupted firmly, "with interest. Proper paperwork. Done by Judge Mason himself." From his other pocket came a carefully folded document, the judge's seal clearly visible. Nothing fancy, just honest terms. She opened the pouch with trembling fingers. The coins inside weren't enough to replace all she'd lost, but they would keep her business alive through the lean months ahead. The loan document was simple, its interest rate fair, its terms clear as mountain water. "Thank you," she managed, knowing the words were inadequate. Thomas nodded once and turned to go. At the door, he paused. "Crawford's vault? Empty since Tuesday. Man who knows horses knows when somebody's fixing to run." Sarah clutched her mother's locket, watching him return to his stable through the evening shadows. The silver felt warm in her palm, its presence a reminder that some things of true value couldn't be stolen by men with soft hands and false promises. The summer storm broke over Copper Creek with biblical fury, turning the afternoon sky an ominous green-black. Sarah stood at her shop window, watching townsfolk hurry past in search of shelter. The newly patched roof above her head, Thomas's handiwork from the week before, creaked but held firm against the rising wind. Thunder cracked overhead like a whip, and Sarah found her hand moving instinctively to her mother's locket. These past weeks since Crawford's betrayal had taught her much about weather of all kinds, both the sort that brought rain and the kind that brought whispers. The town's sympathy had been generous at first, then slowly curdled into something less charitable as rumors circulated about her poor judgment with men. A flash of movement caught her eye. Thomas was outside, helping old Mrs. Carson secure her laundry before the rain could claim it. His movements were unhurried, despite the approaching storm, each piece of clothing carefully folded and placed in her basket. The old woman's gratitude was evident in her gesture to come inside, but Thomas simply tipped his hat and turned toward his stable. The first heavy drops began to fall as he crossed the street. Sarah found herself opening her door without conscious thought. "You'll catch your death," she called, surprising herself with the concern in her voice. He paused, rain already darkening his shoulders. For a moment she thought he might decline, but another crack of thunder made the decision. He stepped inside just as the heavens truly opened, bringing with him the scent of rain and leather and honest work. "Roof'll hold," he said, nodding upward as the rain drummed overhead. "Oak beams don't mind storms much." "Like the wagon wheels," Sarah replied, remembering. She moved to light the lamp, the afternoon darkness making it necessary. "You knew this weather was coming, didn't you? That's why you insisted on fixing the roof last week." His slight smile was answer enough. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the storm's fury through the window. Sarah found herself studying his reflection in the glass, the quiet strength in his bearing, the careful way he held himself as a guest in her space. So different from Crawford's proprietary lounging or Wellington's theatrical poses. "The town's been talking," she said finally, voicing what had weighed on her mind, "about my choices in men, about how much I lost." Thomas's reflection remained steady. "Town talks about lots of things. Most ain't worth the breath spent on them. Mrs. Whittaker suggested I might need a guardian for my business affairs." The words still stung, days later, as if being deceived twice makes me incapable of managing my own life. "Folks who never fell don't know much about getting back up." His voice was quiet but firm. "You're still here, still standing. That says more than their talk." A particularly violent gust rattled the windows, but the panes held firm in their frames, another of Thomas's improvements. Sarah watched as a loose shutter from the building across the street went cartwheeling down the muddy road. "I've been meaning to thank you," she said, fingers brushing the loan document she now kept in her pocket. "Not just for the money, but for seeing things clearly when I couldn't." He shook his head slightly. "Ain't about seeing clear, it's about knowing what matters. Money comes and goes." His eyes met hers in the window's reflection. "Truth stays." The storm was beginning to ease, the thunder now a distant growl. Sarah thought about truth, about the different ways it could present itself. Sometimes it came dressed in fine clothes and bankers' promises. Sometimes it came covered in stable dust, speaking rarely but meaning every word. Storms passing. Thomas observed, though neither of them moved. In the gentle light of her lamp, Sarah noticed a small scar near his temple, usually hidden by his hat. A mark of some past struggle, worn without drama or complaint. "Yes," she replied, understanding they were speaking of more than weather, "but the foundation's solid." He nodded once, and in that simple gesture she read volumes about strength and persistence, and the quiet dignity of weathering whatever storms might come. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but its rhythm had changed from assault to blessing, nourishing the ground that had held firm beneath its fury. The tattered newspaper arrived on Sarah's counter without ceremony, delivered by Miss Hayes from the telegraph office. The young operator's face was flushed with the excitement of someone bearing significant news. "You'll want to read this, Miss Bennett, especially the social column from Denver." Sarah smoothed the wrinkled pages, her eyes finding the article in question. There, in crisp black type, was a story that sent ripples through her understanding of Copper Creek's social fabric. Mrs. Whittaker's much-praised Eastern connections, her claims to Boston society, all fabrications. The woman who had judged Sarah's every decision had built her own position on carefully constructed lies. "There's more," Miss Hayes said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That same paper mentions Charles Wellington. He's been arrested again, this time in Sacramento. And Mr. Crawford," she paused dramatically, "he was caught trying to board a ship to Australia with Mrs. Whittaker's invested funds." Sarah sat heavily in her chair, the implications settling like dust after a strong wind. The very people who had criticized her judgment had fallen prey to the same smooth lies, the same polished deceptions. But they had hidden their losses behind sharp tongues and sharper judgments of others. The shop bell chimed, and Sarah quickly folded the paper as Mrs. Harrison entered. The older woman took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "I see the news has reached you, though I suspect Thomas knew about Mrs. Whittaker's background months ago." "Thomas?" Sarah and Miss Hayes asked in unison. Mrs. Harrison settled herself comfortably on the chair Thomas had recently mended. "Oh, yes. His sister works as a housekeeper for a genuine Boston family, the Cabots, when Mrs. Whittaker claimed connection. To them, Thomas wrote to ask about her. The reply was quite illuminating, I understand." Sarah remembered Thomas's careful distance from Mrs. Whittaker's social gatherings, his quiet ways of steering clear of her grandiose plans. He had known, yet never used the information to diminish or expose the woman. Even now, with the truth public, he remained at his stable, tending to his work without commentary. "The town council meets tonight," Mrs. Harrison continued, smoothing her skirts. "I suspect there will be some changes in leadership. Mrs. Whitaker's position as head of the Ladies' Aid Society seems uncertain." As if summoned by discussion of her downfall, Mrs. Whitaker herself appeared in the shop doorway. Gone was the usual imperial bearing. Her shoulders bore the weight of exposed pretense. Her eyes fell on the newspaper in Sarah's hands, and a flush crept up her neck. "I suppose," she said stiffly, "you're all enjoying this morning's news." Sarah thought of Thomas's silence in the face of known deception, his choice to let truth reveal itself in its own time. "Actually," she replied, standing to move behind her counter, "I was just about to start work on a new hat. Perhaps you'd like to order one. Something practical, suited to who we really are." The older woman's lips trembled slightly, tears threatening to breach her composure. "You're not going to... That is, I thought surely you'd want to..." "Want to what, Mrs. Whitaker? Gossip? Judge? I've learned there are better ways to spend one's energy." Sarah began arranging her materials with deliberate care. "Now, about that hat. I'm thinking a sturdy felt, nothing too ornate. Something that can weather any storm." Understanding dawned in Mrs. Whitaker's eyes. Understanding and something that might have been gratitude. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I think that would be appropriate." Through the window, Sarah caught sight of Thomas leading a horse to be shod. His honest labor stood in stark contrast to the social pretensions crumbling around them. He had known all along about Mrs. Whitaker's facade, about Crawford's schemes, about Wellington's frauds, yet he had chosen to build and repair, to strengthen and support, rather than tear down. Later that evening, as Sarah recorded the days, events in her journal, she realized something profound about power and truth. The strongest position wasn't in wielding knowledge as a weapon, but in using it to understand, to help, to build. Thomas had taught her that, not through words, but through the quiet dignity of his choices. The newspaper lay folded on her desk, its revelations already yesterday's news. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between judgment and grace. Sarah touched her mother's locket, remembering its lessons about true worth, and smiled. Some revelations weren't found in newspaper columns, but in the daily choice to rise above pettiness and extend a helping hand, even to those who had once dealt in scorn. Sarah discovered the simple wooden cross by accident. She had ventured to the small cemetery on the hill to place flowers on young Jimmy Carson's grave. The widow's son had succumbed to fever the previous winter, when she noticed Thomas kneeling before a weathered marker in the far corner, not wishing to intrude. On his private moment, she began to withdraw, but he had already sensed her presence. "My father," he said quietly, running calloused fingers over the carved name, "Edward James Miller, 1819-1862, taught me everything worth knowing about wood and worth and waiting to speak until words mean something." It was the most he'd ever said about his past at one time. Sarah stood still, understanding she was being offered a rare glimpse behind his careful silence. The cross, she noticed, showed the same attention to detail that marked all his work, the joints perfectly squared, the surface smooth despite years of weather. "You made this for him," she said, not really a question. Thomas nodded. "After Gettysburg, came out here to bring him a proper marker. Ended up staying." His hand lingered on the crossbeam. He was a furniture maker back in Pennsylvania, had a shop, customers who appreciated quality work. Then the war came. Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. Around them, the late afternoon light painted the prairie grass gold, and meadowlarks called from distant fence posts. "He volunteered as a wagon master," Thomas continued, his voice holding memories. "Said if he couldn't fight, he could at least keep the supply trains running. Died making sure medicine reached the field hospitals." A pause. Never did anything showy, just did what needed doing. Sarah thought about Thomas's own quiet way of tending to the town's needs. The repaired wheels, the strengthened doors, the subtle warnings about dishonest men. He taught you well. A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. Used to say true craft doesn't need fancy words, shows itself in the work. He stood, brushing dust from his knees. Had a big shop in Philadelphia before the war. Apprentices, fine customers. Could have gone back to that after. Why didn't you? He turned slightly, surveying the town spread below them. Some men come back needing noise and company to drown out memories. Some need quiet to make peace with them. His eyes met hers. Found what I needed here. Simple work, space to think, people who don't ask more than a man can give. Sarah understood suddenly why he had chosen the stable, not just employment, but a place where the rhythm of honest work and the wisdom of horses could heal what war had broken. She thought of the way he watched over the town, anticipating needs, preventing disasters before they could take root. Your father would be proud, she said softly, of how you've used what he taught you. Thomas shook his head slightly, just trying to do what's needed. Like he did. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small carved horse, offering it to her. Made these for local children when I first came, helped quiet my hands when nights were long. Sarah accepted the carving, marveling at its detail. The flowing mane, the proud arch of neck, the sense of motion captured in still wood. This was the work of a master craftsman, not a simple stable hand. She thought of Mrs. Whitaker's dismissive glances, of Wellington's condescension, of how many had overlooked the quiet man who had chosen to serve rather than shine. There's a chest, he said suddenly, in my workshop, full of pieces I made after, furniture mostly. Been meaning to find homes for them. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. Maybe you could help. Know what people need from your shop, what might suit them. Sarah recognized the offer for what it was, not just trust, but a sharing of his private healing, his way of turning grief into beauty. I'd be honored, she replied. They walked back toward town together, the wooden horse, warm in Sarah's palm. As they passed the stable, she noticed details she'd overlooked before. The perfect angle of the roof beams, the precise fit of the door in its frame, the subtle, decorative touch where functional pieces met. You never stopped being a craftsman, she realized aloud. You just found different things that needed building. Thomas adjusted his hat against the setting sun. Pa used to say, every piece of wood has its proper purpose. Just got to listen close enough to hear what it wants to be. He looked at her directly. Same with people, maybe. Not about making them what you want, about helping them be what they already are. Sarah clutched the carved horse, understanding that she had been given more than a wooden toy. She had been offered a glimpse of the man himself, his pain, his purpose, and his quiet way of rebuilding a world that war had shattered. The broken window in Sarah's shop spoke of more than mere vandalism. A rock lay among the shattered glass, wrapped in a piece of paper bearing a crude message. Time to pay for protection. The morning sun caught the edges of the broken panes, casting jagged shadows across her counter where Thomas now stood, examining the damage with grave attention. Third one this week, Sheriff Thompson said from the doorway. First the general store, then Miss Hayes at the telegraph office. He pushed his hat back, revealing a deeply furrowed brow. Randall's favorite tactic, softening up towns before he hits them. Sarah watched as Thomas ran his fingers along the window frame, checking something only he could sense. They had help, he said quietly. Glass broke clean at the edges. Someone who knows how. The sheriff nodded grimly. Inside. Man, most likely. Randall always plants one ahead. He turned to Sarah. Miss Bennett, I must insist you deposit any valuables in the bank vault. We can't guarantee... No. The word came firmly from both Sarah and Thomas, surprising them both. Sarah continued, Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but I've learned something about banks and vaults and promises of protection. Thomas had moved to gather the broken glass, his movements precise and purposeful. "I'll have this fixed before sunset," he said. Though Sarah heard the deeper meaning beneath the simple offer, every repair he'd made to her shop had strengthened it against more than weather. After the sheriff left, Sarah found herself standing close to Thomas as he took measurements for the new window. "You've seen this before, haven't you? Towns under siege?" He paused in his work, considering. "During the war, saw how people react to fear. Some band together, some look for profit in it." His eyes met hers. "Some find strength they didn't know they had." A commotion from the street drew their attention. Doc Wilson's buggy was racing into town, the usually composed physician shouting for help. "Fire at the Carson place." The widow's small ranch lay just outside town, where she kept a few cattle and the vegetable garden that helped support her and her remaining children. Thomas was moving before the doctor finished speaking, swinging onto his horse with fluid grace. Others scrambled to follow, but he was already disappearing down the road, dust rising in his wake. Sarah found herself running to her own horse, the side saddle be damned. She arrived to find Thomas and Mrs. Carson standing amid scorched grass and smouldering fence posts. The house had been spared, but the barn's exterior showed clear signs of deliberate burning. "Warning," Mrs. Carson said shakily. "They said next time it would be the house, unless you sell the cattle for whatever price they offer," Thomas finished, his voice hard with contained anger. He was examining marks in the dirt near the barn. 4 men, 1 stayed mounted, others used coal oil. He pointed to distinct boot prints. 1 limps slightly, left foot. Sarah remembered what Mrs. Harrison had said about his time in the war. He'd learned to read signs like this as a matter of survival, she realized. Now he was using those skills to protect them all. Throughout the day, Thomas rode the outskirts of town, checking other outlying properties. Sarah accompanied him on. Several stops, watching as he pointed out defensive weaknesses, suggested improvements, helped move valuable stock closer to town. At each place, he left something of himself, a strengthened latch, a repaired gate, a quiet word of advice. As evening approached, they sat on Mrs. Carson's porch, watching her children and cattle safely settled for the night. Thomas had spent hours repairing her barn, not just fixing the fire damage, but reinforcing it against future attacks. "You're preparing us all," Sarah said softly. "Have been since that first sheriff's notice." He nodded, wiping honest sweat from his brow. "Town's got heart, just needs to find its spine." He looked at her directly. "Fear's like dry rot, looks solid on the surface till everything crumbles at once." Sarah thought of the rock through her window, meant to spread that very rot of fear. But sitting here, watching Thomas's quiet strength flow into practical protection, she felt something else taking root instead: determination, courage, the will to stand firm. "They're coming," she said, not really a question. "Yes." He turned, slightly, surveying the darkening landscape with experienced eyes. "But they don't know this town, don't know its people." His hand brushed something under his coat, a soldier's gesture, she realized, though she'd never seen him carry a gun. "Don't know that some fights are won before the first shot, by choosing what kind of fear you feed." The evening wind carried the scent of scorched wood and coming rain, but beneath it, Sarah caught the familiar notes of leather and horses and honest work. Sometimes, she was learning, the strongest defense wasn't in steel vaults or promised protection, but in the quiet preparation of those who understood that true safety, like true craft, was built one careful piece at a time. The military medal caught the dawn light as Thomas pulled it from his trunk, its brass surface dulled by years of storage. Sarah stood in the stable doorway, watching as he carefully pinned it inside his coat. Not for show, she realized, but as a private reminder of who he had been, who he might need to be again. Randall's gang had struck at false dawn, exactly as Thomas had predicted. Their first warning had been Miss Hayes's coded telegraph tap. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, moments before the lines went dead. Now gunfire peppered the early. Morning silence, but it wasn't the chaotic violence the gang had surely expected. "Lieutenant Miller," Sheriff Thompson's voice carried over the din. "East Side's holding." Sarah's eyes widened at the title, but there was no time to dwell on revelations. Thomas, Lieutenant Miller, was already moving, his usual quiet efficiency transformed into fluid command. The past weeks of preparation were bearing fruit. Townspeople moved with purpose to predetermined positions, following plans he had gradually, quietly put in place. "Stay with Mrs. Harrison," he told Sarah, checking his rifle with practiced hands. "Back rooms reinforced. Others will—" He stopped as a new volley of shots rang out, followed by screams from the direction of the Carson place. "They're not supposed to be there," Sarah said, remembering the careful plans. "Mrs. Carson and the children were meant to be in town by now." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Not fear, but the calm determination she had seen when he faced the stable fire last summer. Without a word, he swung onto his horse, but Sarah was already mounting her own. His look of protest met her steady gaze. "I know the back trail to the Carson place," she said firmly, "the one you showed me last week." For a moment, the lieutenant warred with the quiet, stable hand in his eyes. Then he nodded once, and they were riding, ducking low as bullets sparked off nearby rocks. Sarah led them through a shallow gully around the back of the old Fuller place, exactly as Thomas had taught her during those careful social calls that had really been reconnaissance. They heard Mrs. Carson before they saw her, her voice strong and clear, telling her children to stay down. 4 of Randall's men had hemmed them in against the barn, more interested in torment than efficiency. They hadn't expected resistance from a widow's ranch. They certainly hadn't expected Thomas. He dropped 2 before they knew he was there, his rifle speaking with the same precise economy as his daily work. No wasted motion, no dramatic flourishes, just the practiced skill of a man who had learned his deadly trade too well and had spent years trying to forget it. Sarah's own shot went wide, but it scattered the remaining raiders, giving Mrs. Carson time to hustle her children toward the relative safety of the root cellar. Thomas used the moment to close distance, his horse moving like an extension of his will. Up close, the raiders got their first clear look at what they were facing, not a simple stable hand playing at heroics, but a veteran cavalry officer with hard-earned wisdom in his eyes. "Randall's using you as a diversion," he said calmly, his rifle never wavering. "Main force is probably hitting the bank now, while the sheriff's occupied here." His voice carried the same quiet authority he used with spooked horses. "Walk away. Before this gets worse." One rider chose to draw instead. Sarah would later struggle to describe what happened next. The liquid grace of Thomas's movement, the precision of his response, the way he seemed to flow through the space between moments. When stillness returned, the rider lay groaning in the dirt, his gun hand shattered. "Choose," Thomas told the last man, who had finally recognized the medal partially visible inside the dusty coat. The raider chose the better part of valor, fleeing back toward town. It was over so quickly that Sarah found herself struggling to understand what she'd seen. This was her quiet Thomas, who spoke through actions rather than words, who preferred fixing things to breaking them. Yet watching him secure the prisoners with practiced ease, she realized that this too was a kind of mending, not of wood or metal, but of a moment broken by violence. Mrs. Carson emerged from the root cellar, her children wide-eyed but unharmed. "Lieutenant," she said, noting the medal with new understanding. "All this time—" "Just Thomas, ma'am," he replied, already checking his horse for the ride back. "Town's not secure yet." But Sarah had seen something in that moment of revelation. Not just the soldier he had been, but the man who had chosen to lay that burden down, who had found a different way to serve. The medal's dull brass caught the strengthening sunlight as they rode back toward town, not as a symbol of past glory, but as a reminder that true courage often shines brightest when it chooses peace over power. The repaired shop sign caught the morning light. its fresh paint a defiant answer to the chaos of the previous day. Sarah traced the letters with gentle fingers, remembering how she'd found Thomas working on it in the pre-dawn hours, after the last of Randall's men had been locked away. Even now, with the town still buzzing about Lieutenant Miller's tactical brilliance, he had returned to his quiet work of mending what was broken. The bank vault was empty, Mrs. Harrison shared over early morning coffee, her voice carrying equal measures of amazement and vindication. Thomas had convinced most folks to move their valuables weeks ago, said something about not keeping all the eggs in one basket. She smiled. Randall's whole plan depended on the town's wealth being in one place. Instead, all they found were ledger books and empty strong boxes. Sarah thought of her own small safe, now hidden beneath newly laid floorboards in Thomas's stable. His suggestion, delivered so carefully she almost missed its tactical significance. He had protected them all, not through force of arms, but through quiet preparation and earned trust. "They're saying he could have been a general," Miss Hayes added, joining them with fresh gossip from her telegraph office. "If he hadn't resigned his commission after Gettysburg, the sheriff's been telling everyone about his combat record." Through the window, they could see Thomas at his forge, the rhythm of his hammer striking iron unchanged by yesterday's revelations. The same hands that had wielded a rifle with deadly precision now shaped metal with creative care, turning destruction into construction. "The army sent a telegram," Miss Hayes continued, unable to contain her news. "They're offering him a position training cavalry officers, full reinstatement of rank." Sarah's heart caught at this, though she kept her face carefully neutral. Of course they would want him back. This man who could plan so carefully, lead so effectively, yet carry his abilities with such humble grace. The military would offer him recognition, restoration of the status he had set aside. The shop bell chimed, and Mrs. Whitaker entered, her usual imperial manner softened by recent events. "I've just come from the town council meeting," she announced. "They're creating a new position, Chief of Civil Defense. They want to offer it to Thomas." She spoke his name with newfound respect. "Though I suspect he'll decline. He seems to prefer his stable, because he understands something about power," Sarah said quietly, surprising herself with the insight about how it's stronger when it doesn't need to announce itself. As if summoned by their discussion, Thomas appeared in the doorway, carrying something wrapped in clean burlap. Without ceremony, he unveiled a small wooden sign, carved with the same attention to detail he brought to everything he touched. "For your window," he said simply. Sarah studied the sign's elegant craftsmanship, the graceful letters, the subtle, decorative touches that spoke of his furniture-making past. But it was the words themselves that caught her heart. Bennett Millinery, Est, 1885, and below in smaller script, "Built on Trust." "You didn't have to," she began, but he shook his head. "Shop needs a proper sign, one that tells the truth." "About its owner," Mrs. Whitaker cleared her throat delicately. "Lieutenant, that is, Mr. Miller, about the council's offer." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "Just Thomas." His eyes met Sarah's as he added, "A man is what he builds, not what titles call him." Later that afternoon, Sarah watched him work. From her shop window, considering all the things he had built in Copper Creek, trust, security, community, one quiet action at a time, the Army's telegram lay unopened on Miss Hayes's desk, and the town council's offer remained unmentioned. Thomas simply continued his work, repairing what needed fixing, strengthening what needed support. When he finished hanging her new sign, he stepped back to study it in the afternoon light. Sarah joined him outside, understanding something profound about the nature of worth and recognition. "You could have told us," she said softly, "about your rank, your experience. People would have respected you sooner." "Respect based on what I was isn't worth much," he replied, adjusting the sign's angle slightly. "Better to earn it fresh with honest work." The sign caught the sun, its carved letters casting shadows that seemed to dance with meaning. Sarah thought about her own journey, From seeking validation in false gold watches and empty banking promises to finding truth in simple wood and honest labor. Besides, Thomas added, the ghost of a smile touching his lips, stables got better company than any officers' club I knew. His eyes met hers, carrying the weight of choices made and unmade. Some things are worth more than rank or recognition. The new sign creaked slightly in the evening breeze, already feeling like it had always been there, much like the quiet man who had carved it, both unassuming at first glance, both revealing their true worth through actions rather than claims. The old letters spilled from the fallen beam like autumn leaves, their pages yellowed but preserved by the dry, stable air. Sarah had been helping Thomas reorganize his workshop, her suggestion, though he'd accepted with quiet grace, when the timber shifted, revealing its hidden cache. Now they sat together on a weathered bench, reading words that bridged the years between who Thomas had been and who he had chosen to become. "My dear brother," Sarah read aloud from the first letter, its elegant script revealing an educated hand. "I trust this finds you well in your Western exile, though I still maintain that Philadelphia society would welcome the return of Lieutenant Thomas Miller, especially given your Distinguished Service Cross and Professor Hamilton's repeated offers to restore your position at the university." She paused, looking at Thomas with new understanding. "You were a professor." He nodded slightly, running calloused fingers over the familiar handwriting. "Ancient languages and literature. Before the war." His eyes held distant memories. "Taught Virgil to boys who'd never seen real combat. Then Gettysburg showed me what the Aeneid truly meant." Another letter revealed more. Correspondence from colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, speaking of brilliant translations, of innovations in teaching methodology, of a young professor whose future had seemed as polished and certain as Mrs. Whitaker's false social credentials. "Your thesis on pastoral themes in classical poetry remains our department's standard," one former colleague had written. "Surely tending actual horses in some frontier town cannot provide the intellectual stimulation you once found in Alexandria's great works." Sarah watched Thomas's expression as she read, seeing not shame at his choice to step away from academia, but a deep certainty. "They never understood, did they, what you found out here? Books tell us about life," he said slowly, choosing his words with professorial care. "But sometimes we need to live it instead after the war." He paused, gathering thoughts. "Needed something real, something I could touch, make better with my hands." More letters emerged, from his sister Elizabeth, now a Boston socialite, alternating between exasperation at his choices and pride in his quiet integrity. From former students, some of whom had died in the same war that had transformed their professor. From his father, the furniture maker who had taught him that beauty could exist in utility, that truth could speak through crafted wood as clearly as through crafted words. "Here's one you wrote but never sent," Sarah said softly, unfolding a draft penned in Thomas's own hand. "To the university board." He nodded, making no move to stop her from reading his words from 7 years ago. "Gentlemen, while I appreciate your continued offers, I must decline. In my stable, I find echoes of Xenophon's treatise on horsemanship made manifest. In the rhythm of dawn labor, I hear Hesiod's wisdom about honest work. The quiet hours have taught me more about Thoreau's solitude than any classroom discussion. My hands, once suited only for turning pages, have learned to shape wood and iron, to mend what is broken, to create what is needed. I have found in this wilderness exile a truth that all our classical texts pointed toward but could never quite capture." The letter ended there, wisdom arrested mid-flow like a river dammed by circumstance, but Sarah could see its truth, lived out in every corner of the stable, in the perfect joints of handmade tack hooks, in the geometric precision of stored grain bins, in the carefully maintained tools that spoke of both practical knowledge and aesthetic appreciation. "You didn't just flee here," she realized. "You found something." "Found myself," he corrected gently. Man who went to war was all mind, no hands. Man who came back needed both. He gestured to his workbench, where a delicate piece of carved moulding waited for the schoolhouse. Learned that beauty isn't just in books. It's in making things that last, that help, that serve. Sarah thought of his quiet preparation before Randall's attack, how he had used both tactical knowledge and practical skills to protect the town. How he had taught them to defend themselves, not through rousing speeches, but through patient demonstration and earned trust. And the languages, she asked. The literature. A small smile touched his lips as he reached for a worn volume on his shelf. Still read, sometimes to the horses. He opened the book, revealing marginal notes in Greek and Latin, alongside practical observations about carpenters' joints and horse behavior. Everything connects, if you look close enough. Virgil knew about animal husbandry. Homer understood craftsmanship, just had to live it to see it true. The afternoon light slanted through stable windows Thomas had crafted himself. Windows whose proportions, Sarah now realized, probably owed as much to classical architecture as to practical necessity. The letters lay between them like a bridge, connecting past and present, showing how a scholar had become a craftsman without ever ceasing to be either. "You've never stopped teaching," she said softly. "You just found a different way to share wisdom." His hand found hers, warm and sure, as the wood he shaped daily. Some lessons, he agreed, need to be lived to be learned. The town council badge lay untouched on Thomas's workbench, its silver surface catching the morning light. Judge Mason had left it there the previous evening, along with a unanimous vote of appointment that required no response. Like everything about Thomas, the badge waited quietly, making no demands but carrying significant weight. Sarah watched from the stable doorway as Thomas continued his morning routine, checking each horse, measuring feed with practiced care. His movements showed no sign that anything had changed, though the entire town buzzed with recent revelations about the scholarly warrior who had chosen to live among them as a simple, stable hand. "The thing is," Mrs. Harrison said later that morning as she helped Sarah arrange a new display of autumn hats, "we all kept looking for some grand gesture to save us. Never thought salvation would come from a man who spent more time fixing hinges than making speeches." Through the shop window, they could see Thomas teaching young Jimmy Parker the proper way to hold a hammer. The boy had been frightened of loud noises since Randall's attack, but Thomas's quiet patience was helping him face his fears through practical work. "Did you know," Miss Hayes added, bringing in the morning mail, "he's been teaching Peter Carson to read? Not just simple words, mind you, but Latin. The boy's mother found him practicing declensions while mucking stalls." Sarah smiled, remembering the worn volumes in Thomas's workshop. He hadn't abandoned his learning or his teaching. He'd simply found ways to share knowledge that served real needs rather than academic ambitions. The shop bell chimed as Mrs. Whitaker entered, her manner now holding more genuine dignity and less artificial refinement. "The school board has a proposition," she announced without preamble. "We'd like Thomas, Lieutenant Miller, that is." She flustered slightly over the name, still adjusting to the man's complexity. "We'd like him to consider teaching some courses. History, classics, practical mathematics. Not full-time, of course, but you've finally seen what was there." "All along," Sarah finished gently. Through the window, Thomas was now showing Jimmy how different woods produced different tones when struck, turning a lesson about carpentry into an exploration of natural properties. The day brought more evidence of how Thomas had quietly shaped the town's character. Sheriff Thompson spoke of tactical suggestions offered so subtly that he'd thought them his own ideas. Doc Wilson mentioned anatomical drawings, sketched to help explain a horse's injury, revealing a knowledge of classical medical texts. Even Mrs. Carson's garden, it turned out, had benefited from Thomas's understanding of ancient Roman agricultural practices. Near sunset, Sarah found Thomas at his workbench, finally picking up the council badge. He studied it with the same careful attention he gave to choosing wood grain or measuring joints. Town's changed its mind about me, he said. Not a question, but an observation. Town's finally seeing clearly, Sarah corrected. She moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the solid presence that had become her truest measure of worth. Though some of us took longer than others to understand what we were looking at. He set the badge down again, turning instead to check the fit of a new door panel he was crafting. Never wanted recognition, he said after a moment. Just wanted to be useful. And that's precisely why you deserve it, she replied, though I suspect you'll find a way to turn even this into practical service. His slight smile confirmed her thought. School board wants practical classes. Thought maybe, he paused, checking the panel's angle. Thought maybe we could use the stable, teach geometry through roof beams, history through tool development, literature through, he gestured to the letters they'd found, still carefully preserved. Through living it, Sarah finished, understanding. She watched his hands move over the wood, seeing in their sure strength both the scholar he had been and the craftsman he had become. You'll wear the badge then. Town needs to heal, he said simply. Need to build trust again, after Randall, after Crawford, after all the false promises. His eyes met hers. Badge says they're ready to trust what's real, what's earned. Sarah thought of her own journey from seeking validation in gilded appearances to finding truth in honest work and quiet integrity. We all build something, she said softly. You taught me that, whether it's hats or horses or hope itself. The badge caught the last light of day, transformed from a symbol of authority into a tool for service, just as Thomas had transformed classical learning into practical wisdom, martial skill into protective care, and solitary craft into community and building. Town council meets tomorrow, he said, carefully fitting the door panel into place. Thought I might speak about establishing a proper apprentice program, give the young folks a trade, a way to build something lasting. Sarah smiled, hearing in his words the perfect blend of the professor's knowledge and the craftsman's wisdom. They'll listen now, she said. Though you've been teaching us all along, badge or no badge, the stable settled into evening quiet, filled with the subtle music of well-fitted joints, earned trust, and futures being carefully built from the raw materials of present moments. The simple ring caught no light at all. Unlike Charles Wellington's flashy gifts or Crawford's banking promises, Thomas's offering was a band of dark wood, carefully turned and polished, inlaid with a thin stripe of silver that seemed to flow, like a quiet stream through forest shadows. He placed it on her counter without ceremony or speech, letting the craftsmanship speak for itself. Before Sarah could respond, the shop bell chimed. Alexander Blackwood III swept in, bringing with him the crisp air of Eastern prosperity and carefully cultivated charm. His arrival was no accident. She had received his letter last week, expressing interest in establishing a chain of millinery shops along the newly planned railroad line. My dear Miss Bennet, he announced, either missing or ignoring the intimate moment he had interrupted. I trust you've considered my proposal. Think of it, shops in every major city from here to Chicago. Your designs, your name, your legacy writ large across the West. Sarah's fingers traced the wooden ring that still lay before her. Thomas had already turned to leave, his quiet presence slipping away like morning mist before sunrise. But she had learned to read his silences, to understand the weight of things left unsaid. Your latest designs are exquisite, Blackwood continued, producing contracts from his leather portfolio, with proper backing, proper connections. His eyes fell on the ring, and something like amusement crossed his features. My dear, surely you aren't considering. That is, I understand Mr. Miller is a respectable man, but with your talent, your potential. Lieutenant, Sarah corrected quietly, Lieutenant Miller, though he prefers Thomas. Blackwood waved this away as irrelevant. The point is, you have a chance to become something significant, to rise above this. He gestured vaguely at the shop, the town visible through her window. This provincial existence. Sarah walked to the window, watching Thomas work across the street. Young Jimmy Parker was with him again, learning to shape a piece of wood with patient care. Beyond them, she could see the schoolhouse where Thomas now taught practical geometry through the art of joinery. The town council badge caught the sun as he moved, not a symbol of authority but a tool for service, like everything else in his carefully crafted world. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood," she said slowly, "do you know how to repair a broken wagon wheel?" He blinked, startled. "I hardly see what that has to do with— Can you tell when a horse is favoring its left foreleg? Or why green wood won't serve for Dr. Frames in Montana winters? Or how to read the weather in the way chickens scratch the yard? My dear Miss Bennet, you're being deliberately— Do you know," she continued, warming to her theme, "why the classics still matter to a frontier town? How Virgil's wisdom about animal husbandry might save a ranch? Why Euclidean geometry matters to a carpenter? Or how Homer's insights into human nature might help a sheriff keep peace?" She lifted Thomas's ring, letting the subtle silver inlay catch the light. This was crafted from a piece of oak that survived a lightning strike. The silver came from a coin his father carried through the war. Every piece of it has history, meaning, purpose. She met Blackwood's increasingly uncomfortable gaze. "Like everything Thomas builds, it's made to last. And my offer," Blackwood's voice had lost some of its polish, "the chance to make your mark on a grander stage." Sarah smiled, finally certain. "I think, Mr. Blackwood, that there are different kinds of legacies, different ways to measure a life's work." She moved to her door, holding it open with firm courtesy. "Thank you for your offer, but my answer is no." After he left, Sarah crossed the street to Thomas's stable. He was alone now, working on what looked like a new display, a case for her shop, though she hadn't asked for one. The ring she carried seemed to warm in her hand, as if recognizing its maker's presence. "He offered you the world," Thomas said quietly, not looking up from his work. "No," Sarah replied, moving to stand beside him. "He offered me a larger version of the same mistakes I used to make, chasing shine instead of substance." She held out the ring. "Would you put it where it belongs?" Now he did look up, his eyes meeting hers with characteristic directness. "Need to be sure," he said. "I'm not— You're exactly who I need you to be," she interrupted gently. "The man who builds foundations instead of facades, who teaches, and through example instead of empty words, who chose substance over show long before I learned to see the difference." He took the ring, his craftsman's hands steady as ever. "Not offering much, just what I am, what I can build with these hands." "You're offering everything that matters," she said as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "A life of purpose, of learning, of building something real together." The ring settled into place like it had always belonged there, the silver catching light while the dark wood held warmth, like the man who had crafted it, like the love that had grown between them. It made no grand claims. It simply was what it was, honest and true and built to endure. The partnership deed hung in their workshop, its simple frame crafted from the same oak as Sarah's ring. In the year since their wedding, the space had evolved to hold both their crafts. Her millinery forms sharing space with his woodworking, tools, her sketches of hat designs mingling with his architectural drawings. The deed itself was Thomas's work, his classical training evident in the careful calligraphy that declared them equal partners in all endeavors. "Miller and Bennett Craftworks," Mrs. Harrison read aloud, admiring the new sign above their expanded premises. "Though I notice you kept your millinery sign separate, Sarah." "Some things should keep their own identity," Sarah replied, watching Thomas teach young Peter Carson the finer points of leather tooling. Even in partnership, the town had changed too, growing not in size but in substance. Thomas's apprenticeship program had spread beyond woodworking to include every trade in Copper Creek. Even Mrs. Whitaker had found her true calling, using her organizational skills to establish a lending library where Thomas's classical texts now shared space with practical manuals and literary works. Sarah touched her mother's silver locket, now hanging beside her wedding ring. Mother always said true worth reveals itself in time, she mused, though I doubt she ever imagined I'd find it in a dusty stable. Through the window, they could see the schoolhouse Thomas had helped design, where lessons in Greek philosophy now mingled naturally with practical mathematics and carpentry. Education, like life itself, had become a blend of thought and action, of ancient wisdom and present need. Planning to expand again? Mrs. Harrison asked, noting the architectural drawings on Thomas's bench. Sarah smiled, her hand dropping to where their first child grew beneath her apron, in more ways than one. The afternoon sun slanted through windows Thomas had crafted, catching the silver inlay of Sarah's ring. She remembered standing in this same light a year ago, choosing between Blackwood's grand promises and Thomas's quiet truth. The ring had grown more beautiful with wear, its wood developing a deeper patina, its silver gaining character, like love itself, becoming richer through daily use. Thomas looked up from his lesson, catching her eye with the same steady warmth that had first taught her to see beyond surface shine. He had given her no kingdoms to rule, no empires to build, no glittering promises to chase. Instead, he had offered partnership in its truest sense, the chance to build something real together, something that would last beyond their time. Peter completed his first leather pattern, beaming with pride as Thomas examined his work. Another lesson taught, another skill passed on, another small piece of legacy taking shape beneath careful hands. Sarah touched the partnership deed's frame, feeling the smooth oak beneath her fingers, and knew with quiet certainty that she had chosen well. In the end, it wasn't about the dusty cowboy at all. It was about learning to see with wiser eyes, to measure worth in deeds rather than words, to build happiness from true materials that would weather all storms. Their love, like Thomas's craftsmanship, had been built to last, not because it shone the brightest, but because its foundations ran soul deep, as solid as oak, as enduring as truth itself.
Their love, much like the wooden pieces Thomas shaped with his hands, wasn't flashy, wasn't grand, but it was honest, built with care, sweat, and intention. It didn't blaze like wildfire, but glowed like slow-burning coals, lasting, steady, warm. And in that quiet endurance, it endured. They didn't just find each other, they found themselves through each other. In a world so quick to discard what's fragile, they built something unbreakable. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If you believe true love still exists, somewhere out there, subscribe to this channel and share this story with someone who might still be searching too.